Hi, and welcome back to our third and final part looking at the ExplosiaFX in XParticles4. Now, in this part, we're going to take a look at the source object, or the source tag, the collider tag, and then we've got a few other things to look at. We've got the modifiers and particle advection, which is really, really cool. And then we can also have a look a little bit. There's a few other things I want to wrap up, things like caching, where we take a little look at the caching and all these advection channels here. And then also we're going to take a look a little bit at rendering at the end of the video. Okay, so first up we're going to take a look at sources. Now, obviously we've been dealing with this already. And we've got a default ExplosiaFX container and a sphere with a source tag. And that source tag tells the object to generate a channel or several channels. In this case, it's generating heat and fuel. And if I turn one of these off, if I turn fuel off, we get no actual smoke fire displaying at all, but we are still generating heat. So I can go to our display tab, check out our temperature, and there's you can see voxels are being solved. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward to understand, I think, the sliders at least. And you can have no heat at all and no fuel at all, but you can still generate smoke. So if you're just doing a smoke simulation, there's no need to use the fuel channel unless you want to get a realistic looking burning effect. Okay, and we can overdrive these. I've shown this before, but you can overdrive these to a high value. And you see they can become very, very dense. And the denser the simulation, by the way, that's basically saying that there's loads and loads of smoke and there's no heat to carry it. So it'll just sink. But then when I give it some heat, we actually get the buoyancy back from the heat. Cool. Now there's another parameter in here we haven't really dealt with before, and this one's called curl. Now this is sort of how the fluid will encourage the vorticing. So if I go crazy on this, go to 400%, you'll see we get these much finer curls coming out at the beginning there. It does tend to diffuse out a little bit towards a little bit further on. Let's go crazy. Let's go to 4000%. And you can see that we get this very turbulent simulation. So that's curl. If you want to immediately add some noise into your simulation just to kind of break it up if it's looking a bit too smooth, this is your curl parameter. Pressure. Now pressure, I should untwirl it down if that's actually a word. But the pressure here, it allows us to simulate kind of explosions and stuff. So if I've got 0 pressure, it looks pretty much exactly the same. If I increase the pressure to 100, it pushes all of our channels out and they end up flying away from the actual sphere. And you can see that if I move the sphere out, that's being pushed out way further than it was than the actual sphere size. So back to our source tag and press play again. And this is best when animated. So the pressure is best when animated. Say you've just exploded a gas canister or something. Let's put a keyframe. I'm going to turn the ExplosiaFX container off whilst I do this, just because when you scrub with the ExplosiaFX container, it can get a little bit slow. So I just turn it off. Let's make it crazy high. Let's go 400. And let's also animate the curl up at the same time. So let's do that, 200%. What's the default? 30, I believe. And then I'm going to select this keyframe and make sure it drags across there so that it comes back down to the default as well. So we're going to start at 0 pressure, which is actually quite low. I think the default is 10, but that's fine. It's going to animate up and then reduce back down to a normal. And there you go, it starts to burn. So that's a good way of creating an explosion in a simulation. This becomes more apparent when you combine this with other modifiers and increase the resolution of the simulation and stuff. And something really important about the sources, which we'll deal with in a second, is you kind of need to break them up. So what I mean by that is you need to break up you need to paint the fluid in a way. You need to break up the simulation by making your source object have varying amounts of heat or fuel coming off it. Because in reality, this sphere wouldn't be a perfect sphere of fuel. It would have areas of higher oxidized fuel on the outside, and it would vary enough. And that actually really influences the later simulation. So what I mean by that is that when I press play here, first few frames, you can see it's very even, very smooth. Oops. It's a very smooth simulation. So to break that up, we can use some textures. We could use vertex maps and that kind of thing. Let's just do that now, actually. So what we need is we actually need a texture on this object or some kind of weighting or selection to our object. So I'm going to make our sphere editable. Let's use selections to start with. That's fairly straightforward to understand. I'm just going to grab a selection tool and just select certain patches over here and over here. And I'm going to make a selection out of that, which I've got as a shortcut, but you can just go to set selection and it's this one here. So I've got it as M and then comma, but I don't think that's a default. Then we go back to our tag and let's use the tag in our fuel object here. So let's drag the fuel, this selection tag, press play, and you can see the fuel comes off the parts where we've got the emission. Now that's not immediately obvious actually, so perhaps we should use a thin flat emitter or source object. And to do that, let's use not a torus, we've done that already. Let's use something that definitely doesn't look like a torus that's been squashed. Let's use a disk with some radius. This will also bring up another issue, or a solution to an issue, I should say. And there we go. I'm going to add this on, and when I press play, of course, you'd expect it to simulate. However, nothing happens. And the reason for that is that this is not a voluminous object. And it's flat, so it basically, there's no inside volume that the ExplosiaFX can see. It doesn't realize that it's a zero thickness plane. So let's just throw, oops, wrong object. If I throw a cube in here, just next to it, I drag exactly the same tag and we look back and forth. You can see they're the same tag. Press play, that one immediately starts emitting. I can move that around and mess around with it in real time. But there is a useful checkbox. So how do we deal with this issue of the flat geometry when we need to emit from flat geometry? Well, there's a checkbox in the tag called solid. You just have to uncheck it, press play, and there we go. Emitting from a flat surface. So let's do some selections on this. Let's make this editable. Actually, I'm going to give it some more subdivisions before we do that, because I want to do some vertex map weighting as well. There we go. So I'm just going to take a selection on this side, make that selection again, drag it onto our fuel channel, press play, and you'll see it just comes from there. So this is a way of controlling it on some geometry, having it emit from geometry and then having specific areas of the geometry. Just to show you the vertex map weight stuff, let's get the paint tool out. And, oh, let's change it to add. Make it a bit smaller. Oh, I'm making it. There we go. That's, I could, of course, use Vertex Map Maker. That's actually an ideal use for that right now. But I just need to demonstrate a vertex map. So you just drag it into the same tag channel, press play, and there we go. It's constrained to those areas. Now, of course, what's really cool is when you're animating that. So why not let's show off the Vertex Map Maker again. Go to Other Objects, Vertex Map Maker, Texture, drag our geometry into the object field. And then we need a texture tag. So let's go back to the beginning here. Let's create just a simple noise shader. Let's make it really obvious though. Let's do a really high contrast stupil. It's quite a good one. Throw that on there. And then let's have the Vertex Map Maker look at this material. So recalculate map. Let's have a look. Yep, that's working nicely. Now let's actually animate this because I think that would look really cool. 0.7. Just to check that it animates. Yep, nice. Let's press play. Oh, actually, let's turn off the fluid sim for a second. Just make sure this is working. There we go. It's nice and moving around. I might increase the contrast on this. Make sure it's not too dominant over the whole object. And I might just increase the subdivs by just subdividing it again. Smooth subdivision. That just increases the resolution of the map. Slows things down a touch, but no problem. Okay, now let's go back to our source tag and throw that tag VM source into there. Press play. And now we can see it's actually hiding our object, which is a bit annoying. So let's go to display, grid, overdrive that a little bit. I just want to see if it's animating properly. And yeah, you can see the fuel is moving around, propagating around the object. So that's really awesome. That's a way of generating fuel. And you could drive a vertex map in so many different ways using the vertex map maker. You could have an object, you could have particles hitting a surface, those particles then adding to the vertex map, and then that stuff igniting. So you've got like a fuel system. That's really good fun. But that's just the vertex maps themselves. And so let's delete that. Let's get rid of that. And let's check. There's another drop down here, which is the texture. And you can put the actual texture directly into the tag without having to assign a texture. So let's put I don't know, what should we use? Let's use a tiles object, just so it's really, really obvious. Make them pure white, make the bevel small, and then just do lines, because I think that would... Actually, if I put lines there and we actually get rid of there we go. And you can see we've actually got a UV distribution. Now, this shader is not in a texture tag, so if I get rid of this texture tag, there's no texture tag on the object. It's just using the UVs of this disk, and it's applying it to the simulation, and that's where we're going to get our fuel. But if I wanted to just have that visually represented, I could copy this into, or just drag it into, by the way. You can do that. It's handy. Put that back on our object, and you can see where the white, where anything is white, it should emit from. So you can see that's how that works. When it's looking for the texture emission, it's looking for a value. It's looking for a brightness value, much like in the emitter. So you look at color brightness, and like particles will only emit where there's a lighter texture. Okay, so that's very powerful, of course, because you could have burning logos. You could animate that logo on in After Effects or something, and then have that as a source texture, and then put that texture into the source and animate that up. Awesome effects. You could do a burning sort of effect where you animate a gradient out from sort of a radius, and it kind of expands and it sort of disintegrates the object. All sorts of fun stuff. So that's texture and tags in here, and each of these has one of these. So you can have it drive the pressure at certain parts of the object, and loads of control. It's really fantastic. I do, when it comes into production stuff, the more control, the better. I mean, it can be quite intimidating to look at, but there's so many scenarios where you'll have one of these things and you'll be like, wow, I'm so glad this is here. This is going to save my bacon today. Okay, so that's the basics of this object. We've looked at pressure, curl, smoke, heat, and fuel. We've looked at how to deal with one polygon thick objects. All you do is uncheck the solid checkbox. But we've never really played with this color from object thing. So what is that? Let's actually delete let's get a new object in here. I'm not going to do a Burning Man. That would look a bit weird. Let's just do a platonic. Oh no, let's do a pyramid. We haven't done that yet. Actually, let's edit this pyramid. Let's make it more interesting. Let's not preserve groups. Let's do that. Get a framework. Make sure that's wider. There we go. Some elite modeling again. The more interesting the object, the better the simulation, honestly. That's what I've been finding anyway. So add ExplosiaFX source to it. We could rotate it off axis, something like that. Press play, get this nice simulation coming off it. But we need to have a look at the color of the object itself. So I have some scripts that kind of randomly assign color, but all you need to do, so I could just keep clicking that and that would do that. There's a few plugins that do that as well, so check them out. But you can just go to the basic tab of the object itself. And when we're talking about object colors in C4D, we are talking about the display tab, display color as well. So you just go to the basic display color, and you can either set it to automatic or on. Automatic just means that if you assign a material, the material will display. But if you always have it on, the color will display. So that's just something to note. But let's set the color to something unnatural in terms of smoke colors. Go for a green. And then let's go to our solver. And by default, color is actually off. So let's put our color on. I think we can probably no, let's leave smoke on because that kind of dictates the motion of the simulation based on all the other stuff as well. But if you want a really speedy simulation, you can actually uncheck smoke and fuel and just have heat and color emitting. Regardless, let's go to our display mode. Let's make sure we're displaying color. And let's see what happens when I press play now. So we're seeing something very different we haven't seen before. So essentially the object's color is being assigned to the fluid. And this is the color channel of the fluid. You can see it moves around just like all the other fluids. It's following the, I should make the transparency low. There we go. It's following the other channels. So if I look at the other channels, temperature, smoke, and fuel. In fact, we could probably, yeah, we could definitely drop one of those. But either way, we go down to color and we can see this color here. And to prove this, how cool this can be, let's create a duplicated object. I'm just going to assign it another random color. And then the tag's already still on it. So let's just press play. And there we go. We can see that this is now producing color over here. And when they meet, they actually mix colors. Can you see how we're getting a little bit of a mixing of the colors here? And eventually we get into this kind of horrible color mush. But yeah, this is really, I love having the ability to create custom color channels in Explosia. Really useful for powdered explosions and stuff like that, or even just as IDs. So you can isolate different parts of a fluid if you use like high, just pure blue or pure red, that kind of stuff. That's a bit more on the rendering side of things, but just worth exploring perhaps if you're rendering. And there we go. You can see we can do sort of these bright colors as well, or pure colors. Okay, so that's what object color means in this. And we can also take it from a few other places. We can set the color specifically. So I can make this blue one emit. Oh, that's the red one. I had the other one selected, but that one, there we go. So the red one is now set to a yellow color. Let's change it to green on the way. And you can animate this color, of course. This would be quite fun to do. In fact, let's do that. In fact, let's do object color. Let's grab the display color, add a keyframe on it. Turn our ExplosiaFX off whilst I scrub, because that's where it gets slow. And let's make our hue 360. Now that might not work. I think yeah, because it animates the RGB values. So let's just animate the RGB values, swap them over, something like that. Just make sure they move. There we go. And put our exposure container back on. Press play. And that should animate through the color as it changes. Yeah, it's just taking a bit of a while. There we go. Turns to blue. So you can do some really exotic effects with this, having control of a color channel. Awesome. And there's one more called shader. Now this is going to just take the color channel from a shader applied to the object. Now, well, sorry, not applied to the object. It doesn't apply it to the object. It just assigns it in some magical space that we never see. And then that then gets translated to the emission color. So I think we'll show that better on a plane, actually. Much better on a plane. Let's drag our tag down because why create new ones when you can recycle? And let's get a different surface. Let's try a shader we might never ever use. This might not work actually because yes, that shader does not seem to. Oh, wait, our tag is on solid, of course. There we go, it does work. Even though that's somewhat, I would describe a legacy shader. But that works awesome. So you can see here, I've added this sunburst shader, and based on the UVs of the object, it will assign that texture and then emit that into the color channel. Really cool. Try gradient. Let's try a 4-corner gradient. Let's do load preset. Let's grab one of our colorful ones. There we go. So you can see you can have a lot of fun with this. You could definitely do logo work with this. You could create different sort of logo stuff. You could animate these textures as well. Let's try an animated one. Let's try a noise. Let's do a really pinched noise here. 300, give it some animation. And you can see there it propagates around. That's not a bad one to use as default, by the way, if you just use a shader or a texture tag in this, because it just, using an animated noise just kind of, like I said, it varies the fuel, it varies all those channels, and you get a much more natural looking simulation if you vary stuff. So yeah, that's the source tag. And we've looked at all the options of how to kind of pass color from textures and things, and also how to drive these using vertex maps or selection tags and texture tags. Cool. So let's get everything back to default. Let's reset our solver. And let's throw in a new object. So what can be a source object? I've described before, we said that it can be geometry, it can be particles, it can't be splines. However, you can make it work with splines in a sort of a roundabout way, and I might as well show you that as a little bonus. So let's grab, what's good for animation? Let's grab a Mo spline. And let's throw that into a sweep object. And then we can just throw that. Yeah, let's give it an end side. See if that's giving it a thickness. Yes, it has. The Mo spline actually drives the thickness of this object, so you can see it actually controls the sweep's radius. And then in the effector fields, I'm going to throw a something that will animate. Oh, formula, of course. There we go. That'd be cool. So formula. Don't think rotation will have any effect. No, that'll just twist it. No problem. And then we actually need to put the X particles source tag on that object. And let's see if that actually works. It is working. It's just, it's a very low resolution at the moment. Let's increase our thickness of our object. And there we go. That's sort of a trick way of getting it to work with splines. Of course, I'm actually playing with the thickness of the spline there, so it's a bit artificial, but nice little workaround. That's really fun to play with. I have to stop myself from playing with this stuff because it's very distracting from actual work. But you have to make it your actual work, and then you can really enjoy it. So I'm going to throw a platonic in here just to get another source object in. And I'm going to add some colliders as well. So first of all, let's have a look at our source object. Just make sure it's small. Press play, make sure it's emitting fluid. Yes, it is. Let's throw a vibrate tag on just to get it going from side to side. 60, 60, 60. It's my favorite rotation, apparently. Is that moving enough? Yeah, I think so. So what we want to do in a lot of simulations is you want it to collide with a wall, or you want it to collide with some other objects and stuff like that. So what we obviously have the container walls. So if it's just a flat surface, if it's just a flat floor, you would just use Y negative, and you can see it highlights that there. But when you need to actually use other objects as collision objects, we need to assign a special tag and just watch out for certain caveats in terms of the speed that they move and stuff like that. So let's throw in some colliding objects. This is a bit of a classic fluid sim setup here, where it kind of goes from one step to the next. Usually falling down the other way though, except this time our buoyancy is upwards, so different, definitely. So on my two cube objects I just created, we can right click those, or we can just look for it. We can go Explosia or just Explo and then Collider. There we go. And then we look at our collider, and we've got the similar checkbox. So if the object is flat, we can obviously make sure the tag knows that it's flat by unchecking solid. We have a pressure thing, and we also have a velocity multiplier. Now we'll talk about those in a second, but let's just play and see what happens. So as I play, we can see the fluid doesn't go through that collider object. And that starts to get very interesting now, because we're starting to see how a fluid interacts with the objects around it. And I think that's what really gives it some realistic effects, is to actually have it collide with stuff, be pushed around by objects, and all that kind of stuff. So I really love that. I love having a collider in a system. If you have a high resolution collider, like the more polygons it has, it does get slower in the simulation. That's just it's almost in every scenario. If you've got more polygons, you're going to see more or a slower speed in the simulation. Increase the resolution. Oh, actually, let's go to grid. Ooh, that's a bit too many. Yeah, and you get the idea. This is a way of having them collide with other stuff. So let's actually move these objects. Let's actually throw this. I'm going to make them a little bit thicker as well. There we go. And let's have it shifting around. Oh, we've probably given them different seeds. There we go. And you can see something's happening here. So this is worth noting immediately. Go back to slices, reset. Now, with colliders in Explosia, if they're moving and if they're moving too fast, you'll actually eat into the fluid. And this is just a limitation, unfortunately. You can use pressure to balance this out a bit. So you can see here we have this pressure. And that kind of pushes the fluid away before it actually makes contact with the collider. You can see that helps a little bit more. It doesn't quite eat as much. But right there, you saw it went right through the smoke, but it didn't push it out of the way. So you got to be careful of the speed of how fast your objects are moving. And we can use this velocity multiplier actually to exaggerate the effect on the fluid. So it'll push the fluid around a little bit more. Might help it solve better, but not always. But yeah, I find throwing colliders in around too fast, you'll end up eating into the fluid. I think that's just a limitation at the moment. Hopefully that'll be fixed one day. Or improved at least. But if you have slow moving colliders, I think you're not going to see a problem. Okay, so that's colliders and source tags. Next up, we're going to take a look at some advection, or actually no, let's look at modifiers. Modifiers is a lot of fun as well. So we had a quick look earlier at the end of the last video at the forces tab, where we could add wind or we could add turbulence within our ExplosiaFX container. However, of course, Xparticles being awesome as it is, has tons and tons of modifiers, of course, and we can use those with the Explosia container, which is just so much fun. So let's grab one. Turbulence would be too obvious, I think. How about let's just go for an attractor mod. Let's go for an attractor mod. And let's put it over in a corner over here or something. And then make sure that it's associated with the ExplosiaFX container. If I press play now, nothing's going to happen because we haven't told it to include the modifier in this field here, which is pretty familiar. It's got the same system checkbox, include excludes, and then the modifier field itself. So let's drag our emit attractor in and actually see the good stuff. And we can see right away the fluid starts to move towards our attractor. So this is just the start, but you can imagine the level of control that you can have over a smoke sim or a fire sim, whatever you're going to be doing, with all of the attractors that are available in Xparticles. It's really great, and I love the fact that it's so well integrated. Even though this came from another, DCC, this is really wonderful to have in cinema. Cool. So that's the attractor. What else could we throw? I did say we're not going to use a turbulence, but turbulence does look kind of cool. Oh, I tell you what. First of all, let's throw a system object down before things get out of hand. Let's make that a bit smaller. Let's put that in our dynamics there. Let's put that in our... Well, we could put it in our emitters. I guess it is an emitter at the moment. And let's go to our modifier tab. Motion modifiers. Let's take a look at... what would be fun? Well, gravity we don't need, of course. There is a physical mod. Now, this is interesting, actually. That's a good point. We could use a physical mod to actually... In fact, while I was talking about sources, I probably should have talked about this. So if I create a fall off on a physical modifier, or just like a box fall off like that, 50, 50, 50, I can actually add smoke, fuel, and fire to our simulation. So this is really cool. So actually, if I go just set value to 1, and I press play, let's see if this tracks. Oh, it's not tracking. Interesting. Maybe we need to do fuel. Oh, I thought this would work. Maybe not. It was worth a try. So this will work if you have it maybe with particles. I was convinced this works, but maybe I was wrong. Oh well. No, giving up already. Oh, or maybe actually it's not adapting. That might be the problem actually. So if I turn off the adaptive bounds, what about then? Nope, not even. Oh, womp womp womp. No problem. Okay, so physical doesn't work. Let's try a rotator actually. That's going to be quite fun. Rotator, and I might put this into force mode actually to make it look a bit more natural. Oh, and I need to include it. Oh, that's why the physical mod didn't work. Getting caught out by my own, not following my own instructions. We of course need to include it in this tab over here. There we go. So I can actually, this is a neat little trick. If you want to use the fall-offs, you can actually use the fall-offs in the physical object. So I could use a torus. Or even better, let's use noise. Let's go straight to the cool stuff. So I could use the C4D noise, or I could use the XP noise. Let's clip it. Let's make the scale smaller. There we go. Now, this is probably going to fill the whole container, isn't it? Let's check. Whoa. Yes, it does. But you get the idea. This allows us to emit into the simulation. Let's go really high on the clipping. That just fills everything up. Let's try a cone. Oh, interesting. That actually didn't react. Oh, there we go. It has to be in the center of the simulation. Yeah, so well, that's like an ice cream upside down. Look. Nice. So the physical mod, of course, allows you to generate channels. Normally, it used to be for driving stuff in the emitter, but obviously it's all connected. It's all very well integrated. It allows you to do all this cool stuff. So, yep, that's the physical mod with the as a bonus source object, if you like. Let's go back to our normal stuff. We've got wind, of course, but we've got that already in. Let's include that one as well. We already have this in the built into the mod, but this one allows you to add a bit of turbulence into everything as well. You can see it flies off to the side there when it's quite high strength. Very cool. But what I really wanted to show you was a combination with a new modifier, which is one of the dynamic modifiers, which is with the flow field. And this is really, this is fun. So let's add a helix in. Let's make it small at the base here. It doesn't need to be that wide at the top, something like that. Yeah, there we go. And then I'm going to change this flow mode to a long spline. I'm going to drop a helix in. Then I'm going to encourage it to be quite high. I might increase the fall off quite a lot as well. And then I'm going to drop our, I'm going to put this right at the end of the spline. We made that spline a bit bigger actually. Maybe increase the density of the flow field. And let's include this flow field in our ExplosiaFX container. Press play and we'll see what happens. Oh, it's kind of visible. I think I need to make our spline a bit wider at the top. But the idea is that it's dragging it along this spline. So again, way more control of your fluids and how to animate them through your container. Now, I'm a little bit disappointed that that's not following it too enough, so I might encourage it a bit more, might add more direction, or I could do velocity, force it along the spine maybe. Or we could drop, even better, we could drop another flow field in, and we could have it 2 spline. Press play. Maybe that'll keep it a bit closer, maybe not. We'll see. Because you've obviously got all the other forces involved here as well. So you've got the buoyancy force and all that stuff as well. But how cool is that? You can kind of create a vorticing. It's really cool. but with all the fluid stuff on it as well. All right, so that's the modifiers and how they work with this system. Really good fun, really simple to set up as well. Like I said, they do diffuse the simulation a little bit, so you might want to, if you're just doing turbulence or wind, use the forces tab here. Okay, so we're going to actually go back to the solver tab here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what this is about. So I'm going to also throw our vibrate tag back on. Now, the advection channels, which are those things on the solver tab, which we're going to get back to in a second. These things here, so let's minimize all that stuff. So these advection things, this is kind of an advanced topic, but basically the ExplosiaFX system has a bunch of different ways of advecting the smoke. And advection just purely means moving the channels through to different voxels and how it advects through a space. So with the way it does it now, it's using these different modes, and there are 3 modes. There's smart, linear, and advanced. Now, the smoke advection is set to smart, and then the fuel is advanced, UV advection is linear, heat is linear, velocity is smart, and color is linear. Now, what does all that mean, and what do we need to know about it? Well, the basics are that smart is the best. You're going to get the most accurate simulation. It looks very good. It's kind of a balance between doing linear and smart and advanced, except it maintains swirling and that kind of stuff, and you get much more detail. However, at the cost of much more RAM and also processor time. So basically, if you want a simulation that's very basic, you just set all the channels to linear and you will get a fairly diffuse simulation. Now, if I save a frame of this, so if I go to I'm just going to go to our hardware, OpenGL, make sure it renders. No need to have any anti-aliasing on. Let's just do current frame. Let's go to frame 80. Oh, actually, no, this is even better. I will set a manual frame. Set it to frame 80, and we'll actually see the simulation time as well. So let's render that to our picture viewer. And as it's rendering, it's processing all the frames before that moment. So until it displays, it was processing all of those frames. So that took us, how long did that take us? That took 5 seconds, was it? And that's in linear mode. So let's go back and reset that to default, which is the smart and advanced in those channels. Let's go render again. And this technically should take longer, and it will also use more RAM, like I said. Not much longer by the looks of it, a couple of seconds, but of course we're using a different speed of simulation. But look at the difference in the actual render. I mean, of course, this is not a very high res preview right now, but if you look at that simulation, that's what happens when you get the linear solver. Very simple, but also not very pretty in terms of the detail and curling. This is with smart and advanced in the smoke and fuel channels and also velocity. And you can see how much better that looks in terms of detail. In fact, we should just up those. And advanced is somewhere in between. If I just put them all in advanced, this will take longer than the smart one, but it's going to be slower than but it will take up less RAM. So that was 7 seconds. Let's look at the difference. So you can see we actually have apart from the resolution change, of course, we have a drastic looking difference in the simulation. You can see up here, look at this is all different. And that's probably mostly due to the temperature channel changing. So if I go and reset those back to default. So having heat in one of the more advanced or smart modes, let's put them all in smart mode now. This would be the heaviest in production by quite a long shot. Not just it's not really the speed of it, more the RAM usage. So there you go, 9 seconds. And again, we see the difference in the simulations. So actually having advanced in the heat channel might give us more detail. We might want that. Also worth seeing these in motion because, of course, they'll look very different in motion. But well worth knowing about the advection channels. It's not so much talking about the advection of the particles or anything like that. It's about the advection of these channels. So the smoke, heat, UVW, and color. Okay, so now we've sort of dealt with that, we're going to take a look at the actual particle advection. Now, this is really good fun to play with. And let me just get rid of that texture. We don't need that anymore. Material. Let's reset our solver, make sure everything's back to default. Press play, make sure everything's working. Excellent. And let's take a look at our particles. Do you know, I've realized that I need to take a look at the particle, the emitter as a source. Let's do that now before we do anything else. How could I forget that? That's a fun thing. So let's create an emitter. Let's make it, say, a circle. This is really good fun, actually. So let's turn our icon off in the viewport, make sure that's there. And we're going to make this a source object for our fluid. So let me go to the display tab just so that we can see the radius of the particles. Press play. That's fine. Let's give it a bit of variation. Different speeds there. And then you'll notice that we're not actually emitting any fluid. We've put an emitter in, but we need to tell it that it is an ExplosiaFX source. So right click it, or we just grab the tag from our source. There we go. And you can see here, this is slightly different in the source tag. If I press play, nothing's happening. Why is that? Well, we need to actually have, so even though we've got these channels active in here, we need to activate some channels in the emitter itself, because the particles themselves carry physical attributes, physical data, and that is found in the extended data tab. So we go to our extended data tab, physical data, and let's add some fuel. We could add some temperature as well. Press play, and immediately you'll see, actually let's add more temperature because that's sinking a bit fast. There we go. It is igniting, it's just heavily emitting the fuel. If I just add one fuel. Oh, there we go, that's better. Awesome. So one fuel I think is 100% in the tag terms. And these act as multipliers now, so if we wanted to get rid of the fuel or the smoke channel, we can do that via this, or we can do it just via the actual emitter itself. And that's where it comes in really cool, of course, is that you can control those physical channels. So the extended data, physical data, all of this stuff can be controlled by a modifier, physical modifier, or you could have them mapped to another parameter, that kind of stuff. And you can see this would be quite a good way to create a flamethrower. Okay, that's sort of the basic way of getting an emitter to emit particles. Let's have them actually decay away. So let's have them decay away like that. So they actually complete. And you can see it's still emitting, and off goes the fluid sim. Nowhere near the particles, because that's all it needs is the source, and away they go. So that's really cool. Now, there's a few differences in this tag. We have this pressure, smoke, heat, fuel, pressure, and color, very similar, familiar things. The color is now a percentage slider instead of a drop down. But if we increase the pressure, of course, that's going to increase the amount that they're going to push away from the actual particles. Kind of creates a certain explosive effect. The velocity, now this is quite important. The velocity, if I increase this dramatically, the particles actually push the fluid. Can you see that? They push the fluid along. And this is really good for sort of flamethrowers where they have actually exerted a pressured force behind them. You know, they're getting squirted out of the end of a flamethrower at high speeds, high pressures, firing them forward. So this forward velocity, so the particles will actually drive the simulation forward. And that is quite a good way to get a flamethrower. And you might want to throw gravity on the actual gravity mod. If you threw gravity on the actual particles. Oh, they're looking a bit sad, not going fast enough. And off they go. So obviously at the moment, because they're moving really fast through the simulation, we need to actually capture them a bit more. There's a few ways we can do that. We could increase the number of particles. So if I went to 10,000 particles, you're going to have more particles adding more fuel to the simulation. I think that's the best way to do it, to be honest, because by increasing the size of them, you're going to lose some detail. And there you can see the particles will actually leave the container and obviously no more fluid being emitted. That looks really cool. Now, obviously, there's another thing that emitters can do that looks really awesome with the fluid simulation, and that's explosions. So let's do an explosion. Let's do a shot. Let's do 2 frames and have them decay very quickly. So in explosions, you want lots and lots of particles, very fast moving particles, but they decay almost immediately. Let's have the solver the container have an actual boundary at the bottom there. So obviously that's too fast. That's like a pyrotechnic on a stage show. We actually want some cone angle. We want some variation in that. Away it goes. And it's too spread out so that we're not actually getting much added to the simulation there. Not enough fuel, not enough pressure perhaps, or particles. Already looking pretty interesting. And you can have these scale down over time as well, so it'd create a nice looking effect. Let's go to a lower resolution or a higher resolution, lower size voxel. Let's double the resolution just to make sure we're seeing things right. So slow things down. But you can see we're diffusing the simulation too much. I think we're moving the particles too fast. Maybe the velocity is too high. And there's not enough particles. So let's go for 5,000. Let's hide the emitter because it's currently hiding everything else. There we go. Kind of creating an explosion there. It's too fast because you can see it's killing the simulation a bit here. We could increase substeps. We could slow down the speed or increase the radius of them. That might help a lot, actually. There we go. You can see you get quite a natural looking, although that's not very natural looking, to be honest. You can get natural looking explosions. If I actually make this a really small emitter, or actually let's get some geometry to emit from. That's always fun to do. Let's get we could do a torus. That's nice and straightforward. And you can imagine the potential here. You know, you can emit off any object. You can emit off textures, all sorts of stuff. So you can your emitter is like a hub as a source object for your. It's like a host source object in a way. Whoa, too many particles. Let's make them last like 3 frames. Let's drop the amount of them down. I think I might have too many of them, honestly. There we go. I think we're going to increase the subframe steps as well. I was hoping that would allow us to emit a bit more, but it seems to be that the particles are moving way too fast. So let's just go to a reasonably lower amount. There we go. That's a bit more realistic. Yeah. So there we go. That's another way to source your fire and your things like that. Definitely good for explosions. You can see there, if I go for a huge variation in the actual particle. Nice. And that velocity multiplier, sometimes you might not want them to push the fluid at all. You just want them to emit from them. You see, the problem there is that you lose the motion in the fluid. So I would much rather have some pressure and like a high velocity push, if you like. And there you go. You can see it a bit more clearly now. This is great for creating sort of sudden explosions. You've got lots of control, obviously, over the emitter. We've currently got it emitting from a torus. You could just change that piece of geometry to anything you like. Just drop a pyramid in there. Oops, wrong object I'm rotating. And there we go, different shape object, different emission. We could have it coming off one plane. We could have it coming off one section of a piece of geometry. We could texture that. All sorts of cool stuff. Okay, so that's just a bonus part. I forgot to go straight to that after the sources, but well worth coming back to. So that's an emitter as a source. Now we're going to take a look at the particles being actually advected by the solver, by the ExplosiaFX container. Let me just reset that to default. And what we need is we actually need an emitter in our scene that we can advect particles of. And we go to an emitter, create the emitter. Now, the best way to view the advection is actually to emit from the same source object. It doesn't have to, but we'll show you that in a minute. It's just the quickest way to demonstrate it. Go to object, and we're going to make it our platonic object, change it to area, and let's increase the rate to our really high value. And it doesn't matter about the speed value, because the speed value will actually be overridden by the velocity in the ExplosiaFX container. So let's go to our ExplosiaFX object, go to advection, click advect particles, and then all of these are active. And I press play, and actually let's hide our ExplosiaFX and make sure the slices aren't being generated. And you see straight away we're getting something very cool going on. You can see the particles are following the fluid. And I can increase the number of particles pretty dramatically, actually. There we go. And they are actually pulling their color from the ExplosiaFX object as well. Let's make sure we're not doing anything weird here. Slices. Okay. And if we go back to our ExplosiaFX object here, and we go to advection, we can drop the color off, so we could actually set the particle color ourselves. And we're not actually solving color in this object, so it's good to have that off perhaps. And we could drive the color in the emitter itself. So what I'm saying is when you have color at 100% in the advection tab, it means that it's going to set the color based on the color channel of the exposure container. And because we have no color channel, that is black. But perhaps I want to take some of these other channels that are being passed to the particles. So obviously the velocity is being passed to the particles. If you press play, you can see they're being moved around. That's what's happening. That it's acting almost like the flow field object and pushing the particles around. And you can get super detailed stuff. If I hide that, you can see how detailed that is. And it's actually pretty fast. It's also quite a cool way of displaying things. So to prove to you that we're actually seeing, in fact, if I go to our other objects, open our XP console, get our active emitter, and I start pressing play, let's just see. Oh, have I added I dragged, control dragged by accident there. Let's go to our options tab in our console, and let's take a look at some of these things here. So we've got smoke. We'll have fuel somewhere. It's just above there. Update grid. Press play. And there we go. Pause. And you can see here we actually have the list of the smoke values and the particle ID and the ages of the particles. So we can see that smoke value is being passed to the emitter from the explosion container. And that's awesome because you can then drive that so you can have the particles change their color as they come into contact with certain levels of smoke. You could have them, so as they hit the smoke, maybe they're turning to darker embers. Maybe when there's a high fuel value or high burning fuel value next to them, that's where they are the hottest, or they look the hottest. That's really cool. By the way, something I should have probably I missed on the earlier talk about the XP console was that you actually can double click these columns, and you can see here we've actually got this minimum and maximum value that I mentioned I'd love to see, and it was pointed out to me by one of the devs, which is fantastic. And you can see that we can get a minimum maximum value here. So we've got the full range, nearly 0 to full 1. And why is this cool? To have those channels in the emitter, we can actually display them. We can use them to drive our gradient parameter. Let's go to smoke. We could go for something crazy like, Actually, let's use this one. I quite like this gradient for this particular subject task. I'm going to put it into auto mode, makes it easier to adjust. I'm going to make it squares. Oh no, actually, let's not go squares. Let's go dots. Press play. And now we can see how cool this is. This is taking the smoke values from the exposure container and passing them to the particles. And then we are displaying the particles using that smoke channel. Awesome, right? So much potential here. You can create sort of sparks and embers burning off the flame at the same time. You can create bubbles in liquid, all sorts of fantastic stuff like that. You could, of course, mesh this, which would be kind of fun to do. Let's, why not? Let's throw it in an OpenVDB mesher. Put that in our generators, sources. There we go. That would be an interesting animation to have a look at. I think you can see the potential here. So by passing it to particles, by advecting particles, we can then create proxies of the simulation. We can create all sorts of cool stuff from that. This is a bit bonkers looking. And well worth caching that one to get that in real time, probably. But yeah, advecting particles, very easy to do. Now, I said you have to emit it from, or it's best to emit it from the object itself, but you absolutely don't have to. It can just get captured by the fluid simulation. So if I actually I've got a little emitter that I've moved down here. If I press play, smoke simulation is occurring, and then eventually it'll reach, you see it's reached the emitter, and that's dragging the particles or advecting them into the simulation. And you can see we're actually in the core of the smoke there when you see just high values like that. Very cool, eh? So, and because I'm creating a very small emitter, in fact, we could have it follow this platonic. We could have it much smaller. Let's make it Y+. If I make it really small, push it off to one side, press play, you're going to get this wispy looking sort of smoke sim. Really cool. So yeah, advecting particles is a really, really strong feature of the exposure container, and endless possibilities with that one too. So to wrap up our fairly deep dive into ExplosiaFX, it's deep because the plugin itself, or the plugin inside a plugin, is very deep itself. There's plenty more to look at. There would be so many combinations of modifiers that I could not possibly get to all of them. I should just say, whilst we're here, advecting the particles, add and set. That just means that if you've set is going to just drive the particles, pretty much the only one you're going to want to use. Add is if you've got motion in the particles already, and then you want to add the motion of the smoke into another simulation. So that's just something to note. But like I was saying, lots of stuff. I do want to wrap it up with just a quick look at how to cache and render the exposure object, and some tips on how to get that looking nice and natural, with different kind of lightings, and how to use a black body object in cycles perhaps. Okay, so I'm just going to reset our scene. Or actually, I'm not going to reset our scene. I'm just going to, let's simulate a little bit. Let's get a nice looking simulation, something that we can render. And I think I'm going to have more fuel pumping into the simulation. Maybe a bit more curl. Nice. I think it needs a bit more detail, so we might go for more vorticity. You can see you can tweak this on the fly and you get nice real-time feedback. I'm going to increase the resolution quite significantly. I think I'll go for a 1.5. Press play. And that's looking pretty nice. Okay, so let's... Oh, that's actually getting out of control. Can you see how if I go too many frames more, that'll actually just completely diffuse it itself. So definitely worth watching out for the vorticity here. I'll leave it at 10% this time. Off it goes. Definitely getting a nice detailed simulation here. And again, it's really getting out of control. It's probably because I've reduced the voxel size down as well. It's very cool. I'm just going to let this cache. I'm going to probably cache 100 frames of it, and then we'll come back and take a look at how to render them. So let's just quickly drop a cache object down in our others tab, cache object, and we can cache the EFX in a few different ways, and we can cache different channels. So depending on which render engine you're going for, you might want to take a look at the OpenVDB caching, which is very cool. And then you can check which channels you might want to cache down to the simulation. So I'm going to just cache down fuel, smoke, and temperature. I don't really need color, UVWs, and stuff like that. So I'm just going to cache that down, and I'm going to build the cache. And like I said, we'll come back and check it out, maybe in Redshift and maybe in Cycles. Okay, so that actually took no time at all. It took 1 minute 34, and it used up a disk space of 1.2 gigs. So a relatively small sim, I would say. And now I can scrub the playback, which is so good. You can see much quicker playback, and I can scrub to any frame I want to. We can also change the resolution of the sim still. Not resolution, sorry, the display resolution. So all the data is still there, and we can increase that, scrub to frames, and you can see it's much more detailed. All right, so let's throw this into a render engine. And maybe I'll start with Redshift, is one of my favorites at the moment. And this works for all the render engines that support the VDB object. And what we need to do is we need to actually associate the VDB that we've just cached, which is under this cache, and bring it in again. So I'm actually going to turn off our system. We go to the Redshift up here. I'm going to add a Redshift volume and go find our cache, which will be in here. And I'm already in this cache location already, so I can just jump to the first VDB object here, click it. I don't want to copy it to the path location, but immediately we see that we've got these channels that have been cached out by xparticles, and we've got density, fuel, and heat. Now, sometimes we need to correct the orientation of the simulation, I've noticed. And we can have the display as points. You can see this is where the simulation is right now. And currently it doesn't know that there's any animation, so we need to go to the animation tab, simple, detect the frames, and then it finds the frames for us. So, oh, that looks like it's perhaps inverted in scale. Interesting. Now, I don't know who to blame for that, but that's fine. What you can do is you can actually invert the scale on the volume object itself. Just double check that's correct. And you can see, this is another way to get really quick playback. You can see there, we're getting this lovely looking simulation coming back in here. So now we want to render that, of course. So I'm going to drop down a very quick and basic scene for Redshift. My interface isn't very well set up for having a Redshift IPR. Let's just dock it here. Get rid of the window title. And let's just get that going. Start rendering. And we'll get that rendering. And you'll see, we can see the object down here is our little platonic. However, it's not rendering the fluid. And that's because in the area light, well, first of all, we need to add a material to the volume object. So create Redshift materials, volume material. Drag it onto the Redshift volume. Let's open up the shader graph. Oops, there we go. And in this RS volume, we're going to tell it which channels to use for scattering and which ones for emission. Now, if I open this up, oh, you can't see it, it's going off the screen, but there's a Redshift volume dropdown, and we're going to look for, well, actually, no, we can just look at the channels, can't we, in the volume object. So we go to the volume object, we get density, fuel, and heat. Now, density, we haven't really heard much about that before. When stuff says density, it means the smoke, usually the smoke. So let's jump into the material again, and let's put scatter in, just type in density. You saw something happened in the viewport there. And then the emission channel, we're going to just double check, is heat. Or fuel, maybe, actually. It's going to be fuel, isn't it? Because it's the burning fuel. Let's do that. So fuel, paste that into there, and you start to see something interesting happening. So currently the color is this black to white gradient. We don't really want that. We want to actually light the fluid for a start. So we go to our area light, volume tab, contribution scale. Then we start to see something very cool. And you can start to see how awesome this is when you see it rendered. And you can see here, I'm moving the light around in real time and getting these beautiful looking shadows, but not such a beautiful looking inner core color. Probably going to change that. So let's go to the shader graph again. And let's change this emission remap ramp here. Actually, we should, the tint is fine. There we go. Very rough right now, but you get the idea. And then we can clip those with the emission ramp. You can see it kind of propagates through a bit further if I have that tighter. We could increase the amount of it by messing with the scale value. But it'll also animate nice and quickly as well. And you can see it burning and churning through there. So this is just I'm looking at the very basics of rendering in a third-party engine. You need to export out of VDB and then bring it back in. Now, of course, Cycles being made by the guys who make XP, Insidium, it's much more integrated. So let's get rid of that. And I tell you what, let's reset the interface, get rid of all the Redshift stuff, and I will come back and we'll have a Cycles layout. Be right back. All right, so I've set up a nice little Cycles layout. And the advantage, of course, of using Cycles is it's very well integrated with Xparticles, and that includes ExplosiaFX. So when we want to create an ExplosiaFX material, we can either create it from scratch using the really awesome node editor in Cycles, or we can go to the Create, Cycles 4D, and we've got these volume presets. And we see we've got these new EFX ones. And I want to have a look at probably the most basic one, Smoke and Fire Basic. I think that's probably going to be the straightforward, most easy one to demonstrate this with. So we'll click on Smoke and Fire Basic, drag it onto our EFX object, and then also we need to assign it to these point density texture nodes. So let's grab one of those, and when we select those, we actually need to select an object to associate with, and that is, of course, our ExplosiaFX container. And we'll grab that there and there. And now those are linked up. I'll explain some more about this stuff in here in a second. Let's press play and just see if that's working. Oh, and we've got a light background. I can get rid of that. Just turn off our environment. And there we go. We're starting to see some smoke in the viewport here. So I've actually got all my display devices going crazy. There we go. And let's pump this light brightness a bit. Whoa, way too much. That slider is sensitive. Okay, so what have we got here? Well, when you're rendering a fluid, you have several things going on. You have the burn channels, the emission channels, that's where the smoke and fire kind of gets displayed. And then you also have the scattering and absorption. So scattering and absorption, if you've ever dealt with subsurface scattering, things like that, that's how a material realistically can be simulated, where light enters a medium, it either gets scattered around or absorbed and never escapes. So it's scattered around and then exits somewhere else on the surface. And absorption obviously means that it won't allow light to pass through it. So all of these things, all of these render engines tend to use that model, and they tend to have a scattering and an absorption. So if you find those parameters, you're halfway there. And currently we've got this node graph, and it's very small. Sorry, it's quite small on the screen. Let's zoom into it. And you can see here we've got this node graph here, and we've got this point density texture node. And that's what's simply connecting us up and pulling in our information about the EFX smoke. Then we are taking the color channels, the density channel, which is the main one really, and passing that into a volume scatter. And then down here, we have an emission. And if we go back, this is another point density node, which is pulling in the EFX burn channel. And that's how we're seeing that. Now, it's a bit too dull at the moment, so I'm going to increase the density on these. I'm going to use a multiplier here. You can see I can actually pump the brightness of those. And I also want to pump the scattering there. And as soon as you do that, you get a much nicer look. Awesome. And you can control the color using this ramp that's already been created for us. Let's change it to a yellow. It's too yellow. Maybe change it to a very light blue. There we go. Now this is really cool because when you scatter a wavelength or scatter light through a medium, you end up getting an inverse of whatever the color that you're scattering is. So you can see where the fluid gets really dense, it's scattering more. So it's scattering more blue light off into different directions. So it's not coming out on this side of the fluid because the light is on the other side, of course. And what that means is you actually get an inverse color, which is the reddish color. And that makes it kind of look like this really toxic, nasty looking smoke, which I love the look of, to be honest. It's awesome. There we go. If I go just a touch into the bluer blue, we get this yellowy toxic smoke. And we can mess around with the density of that by just multiplying it. And there we go. Fantastic looking smoke, very fast. You can see it's rendering on the GPU really quickly. If I multiply that brightness value, it gets really hot. We could also clip the density of the... So you can see how we're kind of getting the smoke occurring around here. We could probably clip that away. Maybe. Gonna be tricky. Yeah, looks pretty cool though. So I can also, the cool thing about this is I can actually turn the display off of this one completely. Turn it off. And then we're just purely using the cycles renderer to preview our smoke. And the advantage of that, of course, is it looks fantastic and we get the scattering and all of that stuff. All right. So that's cycles and Redshift. I just wanted to show you those as sort of the way you get it into a third-party engine by caching it or by using the cache to VDB object, VDB data, I should say. And I could play with this all day, of course. This is one of those things that just, it's very physically accurate, or it looks very physically accurate, at least to my eyes. And you can get some really beautiful, realistic effects. And you'll play around with other stuff in cycles and Redshift where the emission can actually light other objects. And yeah, so that's really cool. Now I should show you of course, the native rendering, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to reset our interface and we'll go back to a non-third party, or I almost think that Cycles isn't third party, but of course it still is because it's so well integrated into XParticles. But I will just reset the layout back to where we were, and we'll show you the default renderer. So here we go. I've stripped out all the cycles and Redshift elements of our scene, and we're back to just a basic scene with no materials. Now, to render in the standard or physical engine, you need to use a XP gaseous material. And it couldn't be simpler really to create this. You just go to Create tab, Shader, XParticles gaseous. Then we drag that onto our Explosia container. Now I'm going to start off a little bit further or earlier in the sim because this renderer is a lot slower than the other two. Of course, they're GPU, so it's very hard to compare them directly without being completely unfair. But let's go to our render settings, and we've created an XParticles post effect. That's cool. Now if I press render, we should see something. And there we go. Pretty quick. No problems. So let's jump along a bit further into the simulation. Let's render again. Obviously, we've got no shading on at the moment in terms of shadows or lights, but that is not bad at all. Preparing XParticles. So this is loading the simulation into the renderer, and then essentially it has to process all of the voxels, hence why it's taking some time. So whilst it was looking hopeful down the other end, it's certainly looking like it's taking its time. And this isn't a problem, of course. Like, we're dealing with very high resolution stuff here in terms of what we're used to dealing with in terms of volumes in Cinema 4D and that kind of stuff. So just be prepared for this. There's you know, I would recommend one of the third-party engines for this kind of stuff because it's just, they're geared up for that kind of thing. And obviously GPU is going to make things a lot snappier. So we're still initializing the renderer here, so it's taking a long, long time. But let's see if the results are good. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the advantage of this renderer is that we could get much sharper fire out and that kind of stuff by using the gaseous material. Now, if I go back to frame 40 and we actually throw a light in here, just going back a few frames just to make it a bit lighter weight. Let's grab them both, add a bit of shadow, and I might make this one a little cooler in temperature. And this one a little warmer maybe. It's kind of 2-point lighting. And I put the shadows on, didn't I? So let's render that, see what we get. This shouldn't take nearly as long as that last one. We're about half the resolution. So you can see now it's also processing the shadows, initializing X particles, but also shadows were being dealt with there. And there we go, that looks way better. So this is how we render it in the default Cinema 4D. And we have control over all of these channels. So we have the fire and the smoke channel. And you can see we get this nice black body color. And then we have all these options for how it's interpreted. So really advanced material. I actually really enjoyed playing with this one. And we have fuel, fire, smoke, temperature, all of those things. So we could render the temperature channel if we wanted. Let's go to our ExplosiaFX container and display the temperature channel. There we go. Now, if I wanted it to render looking like this, I would have to match the, let's go to the exposure. I'd have to match this gradient. And let's see if we can do that. So let's go to the smoke, change it to temperature, right click and paste our colorful shader in there. And I might turn fire off completely. So we're going to have none in the fire thing. But we're definitely going to have some smoke in there. So let's render that. Oh, sorry, some temperature in there. Taking its time. Of course, we're rendering with shading on. If I put it into the fire channel, we might have a better chance. But there we go. So that's pretty cool. So rendering, no problem. Just be wary of a few sort of caveats there. When you're rendering fire, try to always use black body colors, which means that if I go into here, we'll see what that means. When I look in the fire, change it to the fire channel, you can see this is the black body chart here. So this is the temperatures, minimum and maximum temperatures. And I could go to like 7,500 and you can see those are much more sort of organic looking in terms of their color. So definitely worth sticking to those sort of more realistic things. And if you remember earlier, I was talking about the saturation stuff when we were dealing with the display parameters. Just make sure your colors aren't oversaturated, otherwise you'll end up with an unrealistic looking fire and smoke. Okay, so I think that about wraps it up for the look at Explosia. It's gone a little bit longer than I expected to, but this modifier this dynamics modifier is just wonderful. Lots and lots of stuff we can do here. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what people do with Explosia. All right, I'll catch you in the next part.